In the unforgiving terrain where death whispers through every gust of wind and survival hangs by threads thinner than hope itself, some souls discover that courage isn't measured in inches or pounds. Sometimes the smallest frame carries the largest heart, and the quietest voice becomes the loudest call to action when everything seems lost. This is the story of Maria Santos, a 5'2" medic whose hands were steady enough to save lives but whose voice often got lost in rooms full of towering soldiers. In a world where physical strength seemed to matter most, she had learned to make herself invisible, to blend into shadows, to speak only when spoken to. But mountains have a way of stripping away everything fake, everything borrowed, everything that doesn't truly belong to you. They leave behind only what's real. When her unit received orders to patrol the most dangerous peaks along the border, Maria packed her medical supplies with the same careful precision she'd learned as a child helping her grandmother tend to wounded birds. She had no idea that within days, she would face a choice that would define not just her military career, but the very essence of who she was meant to become. Sometimes the biggest heroes come in the smallest packages. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks becomes the one everyone depends on. And sometimes, when the mountains call, even the tiniest soldier must answer with the roar of a giant. Maria Santos had grown accustomed to being overlooked. At 24 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, with delicate hands that seemed better suited for playing piano than carrying military equipment. Her fellow soldiers in the 82nd Mountain Infantry Division rarely noticed when she entered a room, and she had learned to prefer it that way. Being invisible meant fewer questions about whether she belonged, fewer challenges to prove herself, fewer opportunities to fail in front of everyone. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Richardson as Maria methodically checked her medical supplies. Each bandage, each vial of morphine, each surgical instrument had its designated place in her pack. She worked with the precision her grandmother had taught her years ago in their small kitchen in New Mexico, where every herb had its purpose and every measurement mattered. Mija, her grandmother used to say, small hands can do big things when they know exactly what they're doing. Sergeant Williams approached her station, his heavy boots announcing his presence long before his voice. At 6 feet 4 inches, he towered over her like a redwood over a wildflower. Santos, you ready for this mountain patrol? It's not going to be like the training exercises. These peaks will test everything you think you know about survival. Maria nodded without looking up from her medical kit. Yes, Sergeant. All supplies accounted for and secured. Her voice carried the quiet confidence she'd developed over 2 years of military service. But inside, her stomach churned with familiar anxiety. Mountain patrols were legendary for their difficulty. Stories circulated through the barracks about soldiers who'd been broken by the altitude, the cold, and the unpredictable terrain that could shift from solid ground to deadly avalanche in seconds. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as Captain Morrison outlined their mission. Intelligence had detected unusual activity along the northern border, and their unit would spend 2 weeks patrolling the highest accessible peaks. Maria listened intently while her teammates exchanged worried glances and whispered concerns about weather conditions and equipment failures. The mountains don't care about your rank, your size, or your experience, Captain Morrison said, his eyes sweeping across the assembled soldiers. Up there, you're only as strong as your weakest link, and you're only as smart as your most foolish decision. Watch out for each other, follow protocols, and remember that coming home is the only mission that truly matters. As the briefing ended, Maria overheard Private Jackson telling his buddy, "At least if something goes wrong, Santos is light enough that we could probably carry her back down." The comment stung, but she'd heard similar remarks throughout her military career. Being underestimated had become so routine that she'd almost stopped noticing the constant reminders of her physical limitations. 3 days later, Maria found herself strapping on her pack at the base of Mount Katahdin, watching clouds gather ominously around the peaks they would soon be climbing. The weight of her equipment felt manageable now, but she knew that would change as oxygen thinned and exhaustion accumulated. Her breathing exercises helped calm her nerves, a technique she'd learned from watching her grandmother prepare for difficult days tending to sick neighbors. The first day of climbing revealed what Captain Morrison had meant about the mountains being indifferent to human concerns. The trail disappeared frequently, forcing the unit to navigate by compass and instinct across loose rocks and steep inclines. Maria's shorter stride meant she had to work twice as hard to keep pace, but her lightweight frame proved advantageous on unstable surfaces, where heavier soldiers sometimes broke through patches of concealed ice. By evening, they'd established camp on a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for their tents. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since morning. and everyone's breath formed visible clouds in the thin air. Maria moved efficiently through camp, checking on her teammates and monitoring for signs of altitude sickness. Her medical training had taught her to recognize the subtle symptoms that others might dismiss as ordinary fatigue. Corporal Bradley, a massive man from Texas who joined the Army after a career in construction, was showing early signs of altitude adjustment problems. His normally steady hands trembled slightly as he secured his tent, and his breathing seemed more labored than the exertion warranted. Maria approached him quietly, offering water and observing his condition, without making it obvious she was conducting an informal medical assessment.
"You doing okay, Bradley?" she asked, keeping her tone casual and friendly.
"Just tired, Santos. This mountain air is thinner than I expected." He paused to catch his breath before continuing. "Never thought I'd miss breathing at sea level." Maria handed him an extra water bottle and a packet of electrolyte supplement. "Drink this tonight and let me know if you feel dizzy or nauseous." The altitude affects everyone differently, and there's no shame in needing time to adjust. Bradley accepted the supplies gratefully, and Maria noticed how he seemed surprised by her knowledge and preparedness. She'd encountered this reaction many times before. People expected her to be helpless, to need protecting, to contribute little beyond basic first aid. But her medical training extended far beyond bandaging cuts and checking temperatures. The second day brought new challenges as they ascended into terrain where every step required careful consideration. Ice patches concealed by morning frost created treacherous footing, and the narrow trail often crumbled at the edges, sending rocks tumbling into the abyss below. Maria discovered that her smaller size allowed her to find stable footing where larger soldiers struggled, and she began taking point during particularly difficult sections, testing each step before signaling the others to follow. Lieutenant Thompson, their unit leader, initially resisted letting Maria take the lead on technical terrain. "Santos, maybe you should stay in the middle of the group where it's safer," he suggested after watching her navigate a particularly narrow ridge with confidence. "Sir, with respect, I've been rock climbing since I was 12 years old," Maria replied. "My grandmother took me to the desert cliffs every weekend, teaching me to read rock formations and find the safest paths. I might be small, but I know how to move on stone." Thompson looked skeptical until Sergeant Williams spoke up. "Lieutenant, she's been solid all day. Maybe we should trust her instincts on this terrain." As they continued climbing, Maria's confidence grew with each successful section she navigated. Her teammates began following her route recommendations and asking for her input on path selection. The feeling of contributing meaningfully to the mission filled her with a satisfaction she'd rarely experienced in the military. That evening, as they set up camp at an elevation that left everyone breathing heavily, Private Rodriguez pulled Maria aside. "Santos, I wanted to apologize for some of the things I've said about your size. Today I watched you outclimb guys twice your weight, and I realized I'd been an idiot." Maria appreciated the apology, but she'd learned long ago that proving herself was a continuous process, not a one-time achievement. Every new situation, every new group, every new challenge would bring fresh doubts about her capabilities. The key was to focus on the work itself, rather than other people's expectations. The third day introduced them to weather that transformed the mountain from a demanding opponent into a potentially deadly enemy. Snow began falling before dawn, driven by winds that made visibility nearly impossible. Captain Morrison made the difficult decision to continue the mission despite the deteriorating conditions, knowing that their intelligence objectives required reaching specific observation points within the planned timeframe. Maria checked and rechecked her medical supplies as the unit prepared to move through the storm. In conditions like these, injuries became more likely and more dangerous. A simple sprain could become life-threatening if it prevented someone from maintaining body temperature through movement. A cut that would be minor at sea level could lead to serious complications when combined with altitude, cold, and limited evacuation options. The storm intensified as they climbed, turning the already challenging trail into a nightmare of hidden obstacles and deceptive surfaces. Snow accumulated so quickly that their tracks disappeared within minutes, making it impossible to retrace their steps if they chose the wrong path. Maria found herself naturally taking more leadership in route finding, her experience reading terrain serving the entire unit. During a brief rest stop, she overheard Corporal Bradley telling another soldier, "I never thought I'd say this, but Santos might be the reason we all make it back down alive. She sees things in this terrain that the rest of us miss." The comment warmed her more than the hot coffee from her thermos, but Maria knew the real test was still ahead. Mountain storms could last for days, and their supplies were calculated for specific time frames under normal conditions. The comment warmed her more than the hot coffee from her thermos, but Maria knew the real test was still ahead. If the weather forced them to take shelter or move more slowly than planned, every decision would become critical for survival. As afternoon approached and visibility worsened, Lieutenant Thompson called for an emergency conference among the senior team members. Maria was surprised when he specifically requested her input on their options for shelter and route modification. For the first time since joining the military, she felt like her voice carried equal weight in a critical decision. Based on the terrain we've covered and the weather patterns I'm observing, Maria said, studying the map and compass readings, we have two realistic options. We can push through to the planned checkpoint, which will be dangerous but keeps us on schedule. Or we can modify our route to take advantage of a natural rock shelter I noticed about half a mile back, which would be safer but might compromise our mission timeline. Lieutenant Thompson nodded thoughtfully. What's your professional medical opinion about the risks of pushing forward versus the risks of delay? Maria considered the question carefully, knowing that her answer could influence life or death decisions for the entire unit. Sir, from a medical standpoint, hypothermia and altitude-related complications become exponentially more dangerous when combined with exhaustion and poor visibility. If we push forward and someone gets injured, evacuation in these conditions could be impossible. If we take shelter and wait for better weather, we maintain our strength and improve our chances of completing the mission successfully. The discussion continued for several minutes, with input from all the senior soldiers. Maria noticed how naturally she'd become part of the decision-making process, offering insights based on her unique combination of medical knowledge, climbing experience, and careful observation of terrain conditions. When Lieutenant Thompson announced their decision to seek temporary shelter and wait for the storm to pass, Maria felt a surge of pride at having contributed meaningfully to the choice, but she also understood that the real challenges lay ahead. Mountain storms were unpredictable, and their modified timeline would create new pressures and complications. As they carefully retraced their steps toward the rock shelter Maria had identified, she found herself leading the navigation, calling out hazards and safe footing to her teammates. The role felt natural, like putting on clothes that finally fit properly after years of wearing items too large or too small. The rock shelter provided adequate protection from the wind and snow, but it also meant spending an unplanned night at high altitude with limited supplies. Maria worked systematically through the camp, checking on each team member for signs of cold injury or altitude-related problems. Her small frame allowed her to move efficiently through the cramped shelter space, and her medical training helped her identify potential problems before they became serious. Private Jackson, who'd made the comment about carrying her back down the mountain, approached her as she prepared her evening medical rounds. Santos, I owe you an apology and a thank you. You've been taking care of all of us up here, and I was wrong to think your size made you a liability. You might be the strongest person in this unit.
Maria accepted the apology graciously, but her attention remained focused on monitoring her teammates and preparing for whatever challenges the next day might bring.
She'd learned that respect earned through competence and dedication was more valuable than respect given freely, and she intended to continue proving herself worthy of the trust her teammates were beginning to place in her.
As the storm continued to rage outside their temporary shelter, Maria organized her medical supplies and reviewed her knowledge of cold weather injuries and high-altitude medicine. Tomorrow would likely bring new tests of her abilities, and she intended to be ready for whatever the mountains demanded of her. The tiny soldier among giants was discovering that size had little to do with strength, and that sometimes the smallest person in the room was the one everyone needed most. But she knew the hardest challenges were still ahead, waiting somewhere in the snow-covered peaks above them. Dawn brought clearing skies, but temperatures so low that Maria's breath froze the moment it left her mouth. The storm had deposited nearly 2 feet of fresh snow, transforming the already treacherous terrain into something that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. As she emerged from the rock shelter, the pristine white landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. Captain Morrison gathered the unit for a morning briefing, his weathered face showing the strain of commanding soldiers in conditions that pushed everyone beyond their comfort zones. The good news is we can see where we're going again. The bad news is this snow has made everything twice as dangerous. We're behind schedule, but we're all alive and healthy, which means we can still complete this mission. Maria listened while checking the condition of her medical supplies, noting that several items had frozen overnight despite her best efforts to keep them warm. She'd need to be creative about warming medications and ensuring that critical supplies remained functional in the extreme cold. Her grandmother had taught her that adaptation was more valuable than equipment, and those lessons were proving essential in conditions that no amount of military training could fully prepare someone for. Lieutenant Thompson approached her as the unit prepared to move out. Santos, I want you to stay close to the front of the group today. Your terrain reading yesterday kept us safe, and I have a feeling we're going to need that skill even more as we push toward the objective.
The compliment felt genuine, and Maria nodded her acceptance of the increased responsibility.
Leading from the front meant being the first to encounter whatever dangers the mountain had waiting. But it also meant having the greatest opportunity to protect her teammates by identifying hazards before they became disasters. The climb resumed with Maria testing each step through the deep snow, probing for hidden ice and unstable ground with her climbing poles. The additional weight of snow made every movement exhausting, and the thin air left everyone breathing heavily within minutes of starting. But Maria's smaller frame and lower center of gravity allowed her to maintain better balance on the treacherous surface. 2 hours into the day's climb, disaster struck without warning. Corporal Bradley, who'd been struggling with altitude adjustment since the first day, suddenly stumbled and went down hard. The sound of his fall echoed across the mountain face, followed by a cry of pain that made Maria's medical training kick into high alert. She reached Bradley's position within seconds, dropping her pack and beginning a rapid assessment of his condition. His right leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and his face had gone white with shock and pain. The injury was clearly serious, possibly involving a broken femur or damaged knee joint. In normal circumstances, Bradley would need immediate evacuation to a hospital, but they were miles from the nearest road, in weather conditions that made helicopter rescue impossible. "Talk to me, Bradley," Maria said, keeping her voice calm and professional, while her hands moved expertly over his injured leg. "Tell me exactly what you're feeling and where the pain is worst." Bradley gritted his teeth and tried to speak clearly despite the pain. "Feels like something's broken in my leg, Santos. The pain is intense and I can't put any weight on it at all." Maria's initial assessment confirmed her fears. Bradley had suffered what appeared to be a serious fracture, potentially complicated by soft tissue damage in the extreme cold. Without immediate medical intervention, the injury could lead to permanent disability or worse. But getting him off a mountain in current conditions would require everything the unit had to give. Lieutenant Thompson knelt beside them, his face grim, with the understanding of what Bradley's injury meant for the entire mission. "How bad is it, Santos?" "Sir, it's a serious fracture that needs immediate stabilization and evacuation. But in these conditions, moving him is going to be extremely dangerous for everyone involved." Maria continued her examination while speaking, splinting the injured leg with supplies from her medical kit and materials improvised from their equipment. The reality of their situation settled over the unit like a cold fog. They were too far from base camp to carry Bradley back quickly, and the weather forecast showed another storm system approaching within 24 hours. Moving a seriously injured soldier across treacherous terrain in deteriorating conditions would put everyone's life at risk. Captain Morrison joined the conference, bringing his years of mountain experience to bear on an impossible decision. "Options, Santos. Give me medical options for keeping Bradley alive and stable while we figure out evacuation."
Maria worked steadily on the splinting while her mind raced through possibilities.
"Sir, I can stabilize the fracture and manage his pain, but he's going to need surgery within 48 hours to prevent permanent damage."
"The cold is actually helping with swelling and blood loss, but it's also increasing the risk of frostbite and hypothermia. If we stay here, he might lose the leg. If we try to move him in current conditions, we might lose him entirely." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind whistling through the rocks above them. Every soldier understood the mathematics of mountain rescue. Carrying an injured man across snow-covered peaks would slow their movement to a crawl, exhaust the entire unit, and expose everyone to increased risk from weather, altitude, and terrain hazards. Private Rodriguez spoke up from where he'd been monitoring the radio. "No luck getting through to base camp, sir. The storm must have damaged something, or we're in a dead zone because of the terrain." Maria finished securing Bradley's splint and began preparing a more comfortable position for him using their emergency bivouac equipment. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, drawing on training she'd hoped never to use in such extreme circumstances. But as she worked, a plan began forming in her mind. "Lieutenant Thompson, sir. I have an idea," she said, not looking up from her work on Bradley's position. "What if I stayed here with Bradley while the rest of the unit continued to the objective? I can keep him stable and warm, and when you complete the mission, the whole unit can help with evacuation. It's risky, but it might be our best option for saving his life and completing the mission." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge to everything the military taught about leaving no one behind. Lieutenant Thompson looked skeptical, and several other soldiers immediately voiced objections to the plan. "Santos, you're barely big enough to handle your own equipment," Sergeant Williams said. "How are you going to manage Bradley and survive alone at this altitude?" But Captain Morrison was studying Maria with the calculating look of a commander weighing impossible options. "Talk me through it, Santos. How would you keep him alive until we get back? Maria had been thinking through the logistics while she worked, drawing on her medical training and her grandmother's lessons about making do with limited resources. Sir, I can use our emergency shelter and heating supplies to create a stable microclimate for Bradley. My medical kit has enough pain medication and antibiotics to keep him comfortable and prevent infection. The snow actually provides excellent insulation if used properly, and I know techniques for maintaining body temperature in extreme conditions.
She paused to check Bradley's pulse and pupil response before continuing. The biggest risks are hypothermia and shock, both of which I'm trained to manage.
If I stay with him, I can monitor his condition constantly and make adjustments as needed. If the whole unit tries to carry him out now, we risk everyone's lives, and we might not move fast enough to save his leg anyway.
Lieutenant Thompson exchanged looks with Captain Morrison, both men clearly torn between military doctrine and practical necessity. Maria continued working on Bradley's care while they deliberated, using her small hands to adjust equipment and supplies with a precision that would have been impossible for larger soldiers in the confined space.
There's another factor to consider, Maria added quietly. Bradley weighs over 200 pounds, and carrying him across this terrain would require at least 4 soldiers working in rotation. That means the entire unit moves at the pace of the slowest carrier, probably less than a mile per hour, in these conditions. At that rate, we'd be caught in the open when the next storm hits.
Captain Morrison nodded slowly, recognizing the tactical reality of the situation.
And if you stay with him, the rest of the unit can move at normal speed, complete the objective, and return with better rescue equipment.
Yes, sir.
And if something goes wrong with Bradley's condition, I'm the only one trained to deal with it anyway. Whether I'm here or trying to help carry him out, the medical responsibility falls on me either way.
Bradley, who'd been listening despite his pain medication, struggled to sit up slightly. Santos, I can't ask you to risk your life staying here with me. This wasn't part of the deal when we started this patrol. Maria looked at him directly, her small frame somehow radiating authority and determination. Bradley, you're not asking. I'm volunteering.
And this is exactly what I trained for, even if I never expected to use that training in conditions like these. The debate continued for another hour as the unit weighed options and risks.
But gradually, Maria's plan began to look like the least terrible choice in a situation with no good options. Her medical expertise made her the logical person to stay with Bradley, and her smaller size meant she would consume fewer resources while waiting for rescue. When Lieutenant Thompson finally announced the decision to leave Maria and Bradley at the shelter site, several soldiers voiced strong objections. The idea of leaving their smallest team member alone with an injured comrade violated every instinct they developed about military teamwork and protection.
Sir, this is wrong, Private Jackson said bluntly. Santos weighs barely over 100 pounds.
If something goes wrong up here, she won't have the physical strength to handle it. Maria finished adjusting Bradley's position and stood to face her teammates, her small frame somehow commanding attention in a way that surprised everyone present.
Jackson, you're right that I don't have your physical strength, but I have the medical knowledge to keep Bradley alive, the experience to survive in these conditions, and the training to make the right decisions under pressure.
Sometimes the smallest person is the right person for the job. Captain Morrison made the final call after consulting with Lieutenant Thompson and Sergeant Williams. The mission would continue with Maria and Bradley remaining at the shelter site, while the rest of the unit pushed toward the objective. They would leave extra supplies and return within 36 hours for evacuation.
As the unit prepared to depart, Maria found herself receiving advice and encouragement from soldiers who'd initially doubted her capabilities. Private Rodriguez showed her how to maximize battery life on their emergency beacon.
Corporal Martinez shared techniques for rationing food and water in extended cold weather situations. Even Sergeant Williams, who'd been skeptical of her abilities, pulled her aside for a private conversation.
Santos, I want you to know that I was wrong about you, he said, his voice carrying genuine respect. You've proven yourself beyond any doubt up here.
But if things go bad while we're gone, don't try to be a hero. Your job is to keep Bradley alive and get yourself home safely. The mission isn't worth losing either of you. Maria appreciated the sentiment, but she knew that the next 36 hours would test everything she'd learned about medicine, survival, and leadership.
She would be solely responsible for keeping Bradley alive in conditions that had killed experienced mountaineers, using limited supplies and her own knowledge to overcome challenges that would push her to her absolute limits. As she watched her teammates disappear into the snow-covered landscape above, Maria felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy pack.
Bradley's life depended on her medical skills, her judgment, and her ability to adapt to whatever crisis the mountains might throw at them.
The tiny soldier among giants was about to discover just how large her courage could grow when everything depended on her alone. But she knew that this moment more than any other would define who she really was, beneath the uniform and the expectations of others. The silence that followed her teammates' departure felt profound and dangerous. Maria had never experienced such complete isolation, where the only sounds were Bradley's labored breathing, the whisper of wind through rocks, and the occasional crack of shifting ice somewhere in the distance. The mountains seemed to grow larger around them, as if their reduced numbers had somehow expanded the wilderness into something infinite and unknowable. Bradley drifted in and out of consciousness as the pain medication worked through his system, leaving Maria alone with her thoughts and the enormous responsibility of keeping them both alive. She checked her watch obsessively, calculating and recalculating how long it would take the unit to reach their objective, complete their mission, and return for evacuation. 36 hours had seemed manageable in theory, but the reality felt like an eternity stretching ahead of them. Her first priority was improving their shelter situation. The natural rock overhang provided wind protection, but the cold was seeping through every gap in their equipment, threatening to drain their body heat faster than they could generate it. Maria used her knowledge of thermodynamics, learned during medical training and refined through years of camping with her grandmother, to create a more efficient heating system using their limited fuel supplies. Working with the precision of a surgeon, she arranged reflective emergency blankets to direct heat toward Bradley's body while creating air circulation patterns that would prevent carbon monoxide buildup. Her small hands proved invaluable for the detailed work of sealing gaps and adjusting equipment in the confined space. Each modification was calculated to maximize their chances of survival while conserving precious resources. By afternoon, the first crisis arrived. Bradley's temperature had dropped despite her heating efforts, and his injured leg was showing signs of decreased circulation. Maria recognized the early stages of shock setting in, complicated by altitude effects and the body's response to serious trauma. Without immediate intervention, Bradley could slip into a condition that would be impossible to reverse with her limited medical supplies. She worked quickly to address the circulation problem, using massage techniques and positioning changes to encourage blood flow while monitoring his vital signs with equipment that was barely functional in the extreme cold. Her medical training had covered cold weather injuries in theory, but the reality of treating someone whose life depended on her decisions in such harsh conditions was testing every aspect of her knowledge and skill. "Bradley, I need you to stay awake and talk to me," she said, keeping her voice calm despite her growing concern about his condition. "Tell me about your family back in Texas. Help me understand what we're fighting to get you home to." Bradley struggled to focus, but managed to describe his wife and 2 young children waiting for him in San Antonio. As he talked, Maria continued her medical interventions, using conversation as both a distraction from pain and a way to monitor his cognitive function. She'd learned from her grandmother that healing often required treating the whole person, not just the injury. The afternoon brought another challenge that tested her resourcefulness in ways no military training had prepared her for. Their water supply was running lower than calculated, partially due to increased fluid needs at altitude, and partially because some of their containers had frozen and cracked. Maria faced a choice between rationing water so severely that dehydration became a major risk, or finding a way to supplement their supply using the snow around them. Melting snow required fuel they couldn't spare, but Maria remembered techniques her grandmother had taught her, for purifying and warming water using body heat and passive solar collection. She spent hours creating a system that would slowly convert snow to drinking water without depleting their heating fuel, using her knowledge of physics and chemistry to maximize efficiency. As evening approached, the temperature plummeted beyond anything they'd experienced during the patrol. Maria's thermometer registered readings that made her question whether their equipment was adequate for survival through the night. She made the difficult decision to share body heat with Bradley, using their combined warmth and all available insulation to create a microenvironment that might keep them both alive until dawn. The arrangement was awkward and uncomfortable, but Maria understood that survival sometimes required abandoning personal comfort and social conventions. Her medical training had taught her to view the human body as a biological system that followed predictable physical laws. Maintaining core temperature was simply a matter of physics, regardless of how intimate the solution might feel. Through the long night, Maria dozed fitfully while monitoring Bradley's condition and maintaining their heating system. Every few hours, she conducted complete medical assessments, checking his circulation, consciousness level, and response to stimuli. Her small size allowed her to move around their confined shelter without disturbing his rest, making adjustments to equipment and supplies while he slept. Dawn brought the welcome sight of clear skies, but also the realization that they'd consumed more resources than planned during their first night alone. Maria recalculated their supply situation and recognized that they were operating on extremely thin margins. If the unit was delayed in returning, or if Bradley's condition worsened, their situation could become desperate quickly. The morning also revealed that Bradley's injury was more serious than initially assessed. The swelling in his leg had increased overnight, and he was showing signs of internal bleeding that hadn't been apparent during the initial trauma. Maria faced medical decisions that would have challenged experienced emergency room doctors, using field equipment and limited supplies to address complications that could easily prove fatal. She worked systematically through her medical protocols, drawing on every aspect of her training to stabilize Bradley's condition. Her small hands proved surprisingly advantageous for detailed medical work in cramped conditions, allowing her to perform procedures that would have been difficult for larger team members. Each intervention was carefully considered, weighing potential benefits against risks in a situation where medical evacuation remained impossible. By midday, Maria had pushed their heating fuel reserves beyond safe limits, trying to keep Bradley's core temperature stable. She faced another critical decision: continue using fuel at current rates and risk running out completely before rescue arrived, or reduce heating and accept the increased risk of hypothermia for both of them.
Drawing on her grandmother's teachings about survival and resource management, Maria chose a middle path.
She created a heating schedule that would provide critical warmth during the coldest parts of each day, while conserving enough fuel to last until the unit's projected return. The plan required precise timing and constant monitoring, but it offered their best chance of survival if rescue was delayed. The second eye tested every aspect of Maria's endurance and skill. Bradley developed a fever, indicating possible infection despite her preventive care. She administered antibiotics from her limited supply while using physical cooling techniques to prevent his temperature from climbing to dangerous levels. The contradiction of fighting both hypothermia and hyperthermia simultaneously pushed her medical knowledge to its limits. During the darkest hours before dawn, Bradley became delirious, talking to his wife and children as if they were present in the shelter. Maria realized that his condition had become critical, possibly indicating serious complications from his injuries or the extreme conditions they'd endured.
She made the difficult decision to use their emergency beacon, hoping that improved weather might allow helicopter rescue despite the risks involved. The beacon's signal disappeared into the vast darkness above them, carrying their location and emergency status to whoever might be listening. Maria continued her medical care while praying that help would arrive before Bradley's condition deteriorated beyond her ability to stabilize him. Her small frame felt infinitely fragile against the enormity of the mountain wilderness, but her determination remained unshaken.
Morning brought the distant sound of rotors cutting through thin air. Maria emerged from their shelter to see a rescue helicopter approaching their position, guided by the emergency beacon's signal.
As she waved to signal their location, she felt a mixture of relief and pride that was unlike anything she'd experienced in her military career. The helicopter crew worked quickly to stabilize Bradley for transport, their professional efficiency highlighting the quality of medical care Maria had provided under impossible conditions. The lead medic, a veteran with years of mountain rescue experience, examined her improvisations and interventions with obvious respect.
"Soldier, I don't know how you kept him alive up here for 2 days," the medic said while preparing Bradley for evacuation. "Your medical work probably saved his life, and definitely saved his leg. This is some of the best field medicine I've seen in 20 years of rescue operations." As the helicopter lifted off with Bradley safely aboard, Maria remained at the shelter site to wait for her unit's return. She used the remaining time to organize their equipment and prepare for the final phase of their mission. But more importantly, she reflected on what she'd discovered about herself during the most challenging 48 hours of her life.
"Dead does." The unit returned that evening, having successfully completed their reconnaissance objectives. Lieutenant Thompson and Captain Morrison listened with amazement as Maria briefed them on Bradley's medical crisis and subsequent rescue. Her matter-of-fact delivery of events that could have easily resulted in death for both soldiers impressed everyone who heard the report. Private Jackson, who'd questioned her ability to handle the situation alone, approached Maria as they prepared for the journey back to base camp. "Santos, I owe you more than an apology. What you did up here was beyond brave. It was professional, skilled, and probably impossible for anyone else in this unit to accomplish." As they began their descent toward warmer temperatures and familiar terrain, Maria walked with a confidence she'd never possessed before joining the patrol. She'd proven to herself and her teammates that courage had nothing to do with physical size, and that sometimes the smallest person in the unit was exactly the right person for the most important job. The mountain had tested everything she thought she knew about herself, stripping away her insecurities about size and physical limitations to reveal capabilities she'd never recognized. Her medical skills, survival knowledge, and determination had proved more valuable than height or weight when lives hung in the balance.
Sergeant Williams caught up with her during a rest stop, his expression showing genuine respect and admiration.
Santos, I've been in the Army for 15 years and I've never seen anything like what you accomplished up there. You saved Bradley's life, completed an impossible mission, and showed all of us what real leadership looks like.
Maria accepted the praise graciously, but her focus remained on the lessons she'd learned about herself during their mountain ordeal. She'd discovered that her grandmother had been right about small hands doing big things when they knew exactly what they were doing.
More importantly, she'd learned that true strength came from knowledge, skill, and the courage to act when action was required. As Fort Richardson came into view through the valley below them, Maria knew that she would never again doubt her place among the giants she served with. The mountain had taught her that heroism came in many sizes, and that sometimes the tiniest soldier carried the largest heart when courage was needed most. Bradley made a full recovery and returned to active duty 6 months later. His leg completely healed, thanks to Maria's field medical care and quick thinking.
He never failed to credit her with saving not just his life, but his career and his ability to return home to his family. The story of the tiny soldier who'd braved the mountains with a wounded comrade became legendary within their division, inspiring other small-statured soldiers to pursue roles they'd never considered possible. Maria Santos continued her military service with a confidence and reputation that opened doors she'd never dreamed of walking through.
But she never forgot the lessons learned during those 2 days alone on the mountain, when everything she'd ever been taught about courage, competence, and leadership was tested against the indifferent power of nature itself. The mountains had called, and the smallest soldier had answered with a voice that echoed like thunder across the peaks, proving that giants come in all sizes when the moment demands greatness.